Welcome back. The Batmobile, a vehicle as iconic, if not more so, than its driver. In Batman Arkham Asylum, after the bat signal, it's the first symbol of Batman we see. A vehicle racing through Gotham's ugly streets, taking the Joker to the asylum. So where did all the backlash come from when, 6 years on from Asylum's release, we finally got our hands on it and were behind the wheel of the most iconic superhero vehicle of all time? Why did suddenly everyone turn on the idea of this altogether when they finally got it? Well, that's what we're here to answer. In this video, we'll take a look at both sides of the coin, the good and the bad of the most iconic superhero vehicle in the world's attempt to break into AAA gaming. So drop a like, subscribe, and let's go as we tackle the Batmobile issue in Batman Arkham Knight. So first of all, why did people dislike the Batmobile? After all those years of begging Rocksteady for the car, why did the fanbase pull a complete 180 on the beloved Bat Tank? Well, that's the first issue. The very existence of the so-called Bat Tank. During the development of Batman Arkham City, Rocksteady had considered the Batmobile, but apart from it not making sense lore-wise, the roads simply weren't good enough or big enough to warrant a car. In Batman Arkham Knight, however, the map was designed around the movement of the car. The streets were made wider, more manoeuvrable. However, the final design of the Batmobile isn't what many players were thinking of when they'd be driving around this tailor-made city. In fact, it's more akin to that of a tank than the traditional Batmobile. In fact, aside from Ben Affleck's Batmobile in the DCEU, this might be the most outwardly tank-looking Batmobile in on-screen media, something players took issue against. Is the design bad? No, it's actually weirdly cool. I quite like it, not as a Batmobile, but as a Bat-related vehicle. If we take a look at the Batmobiles of old, we can see class. We see a mixture of Bruce and Bat. Batmobiles of old had a look to them, a look of what I can only describe as being sleek. Even as early as its first official appearance in 1941, the car had a striking look, a design which served the character's innate wackiness. I mean, he drives a car with fins on the back and a bat on the front. It works. And fast forward a few decades to 1989 and we get Tim Burton's take on the car. This isn't to dismiss the near 40 years of Batmobile designs in between the two, but to understand my point we need to skip ahead a bit. Don't worry, we'll cover some of the best later. The Burton-mobile has a look to it which fits the feel of Tim Burton's style, while mixing with what the Batmobile should be. Sleek and practical. Okay, maybe it's not practical, it literally can't turn, but you get the point. Burton's Batmobile is arguably one of the most popular movie cars of all time, let alone Batmobiles. It was a brand in itself. Hell, it's the most iconic car in the most iconic Batman movie. If we look past that and move to the animated series Batmobile, we see the same thing. It's sleek, it fits the world it inhabits, and above all else, it looks like a Batmobile Batman would create. It mirrors the suit, it's slick and phantom-like, something otherworldly. And despite its obvious design flaws, it's as iconic as cars come. Furthermore, we can look at the Child of Dreams Batmobile, the Rebirth car, the 1987 Batmobile, the New Batman Adventures, along with a plethora of other Batmobiles around this time, and we see a consistent theme. Aside from obvious design differences, they all look like a classic take on the Batmobile. Without knowledge of what any of them were, a casual fan would be able to tell you it's a Batmobile. Which introduces us to our next case study and issue. Christopher Nolan introduced the world to the Tumbler, arguably our ground zero for Batmobiles beginning to resemble tanks and military vehicles over classic cars. There's a case to be made for Frank Miller's whatever this is as the catalyst for Batmobiles looking like tanks, but the trend didn't really begin until the Tumbler. Now, I want you to answer me something. What's the name of the car Batman drives in the Dark Knight trilogy? If you said the Tumbler, you're correct. This isn't the Batmobile. It isn't supposed to be the Batmobile, and that's fine. I love the Dark Knight as much as the next man. Hell, I've got a symbol tattooed on my arm. What I'm getting at here is that the Tumbler isn't the Batmobile. It knows what it is. It's a military prototype, a realistic look at what a Batmobile could be in the real world. And this is fine, but it's not the Batmobile. Do not call the Tumbler the Batmobile. It's a car Batman drives, but it is not the Batmobile. Where Arkham Knight's first issue lies is also where it begins, Arkham Asylum. When we were all begging Rocksteady to let us drive the Batmobile, we meant this. Not this. This is where Rocksteady fumbled a bit. They had one of the greatest and coolest Batmobile designs of all time and threw it away in favour of their new design, which has no hallmarks of a classic Batmobile. And although we can drive the Asylum car through the Asylum DLC pack released post-launch, at first glance and upon first playing, we don't get the Batmobile, we get the Bat Armadillo or whatever. The design is a small issue in the grand scheme of things. Some of the better Batmobiles of all time have not resembled a traditional look, and so it's not fair to judge a car based on its looks. But I'm sure you'll agree, this is a much nicer view than this. Our next issue is arguably the biggest one. It's the placement within the game. Now, the uncultured Arkham Knight hater will try and use their tongue of lies to fill your mind with misleading words, hoaxes, and duplicitous information that the Batmobile is in fact overused, bad even. But people who say this haven't finished the game anyway, so what do they know, right? This, as you can tell, is all a lie. The Batmobile isn't overused, it's misplaced. The Batmobile is brutally misplaced within the context of the game. It appears in times when it doesn't really need to be there. For example, we can take a look at one of the side missions, Deathstroke. This horse has pretty much been beaten to death more times than I can count, so I won't linger on this specifically too much, but Deathstroke isn't a character you relegate to a tank fight. His fight at Origins is a classic display of the Arkham game's combat muscles being flexed. It's a hand-to-hand fight between two of the greatest hand-to-hand combatants in the world. One fighting for their life and the other fighting for the money. It was a spectacle fight, and one which formed the very backbone of the Deathstroke character in the Arkhamverse, and established Batman's skill because it showed how good he was at such a young and raw point in his career, and it showed Deathstroke as an equal to this Batman. Someone to not be taken lightly should he show up again. But, alas, you know what happened. It's things like this which turn people against the Batmobile, and I understand that fully. It wasn't great. In the same way the car is used pretty loosely, it's used as a vessel to move the story along at points. The previous 3 Arkham games relied on Batman and his skills, gadgets at hand, and it really lent into the world's greatest detective moniker to solve puzzles. But often in Arkham Knight's runtime, it feels like the solution has 4 wheels and an afterburner. This isn't to say it shouldn't be the solution sometimes. A lot of times through Batman media the car comes in handy, but it never feels like the be-all and end-all, and that's what it feels like in Arkham Knight. The Batmobile is forced into so many holes it simply shouldn't fill and shouldn't have to fill. One which has always personally irked me is the fight against the Arkham Knight in the tunnels before we find out who he is. It's irked me for a few reasons, but one of the biggest is that this doesn't feel like it should be the way he reveals to Batman he knows he's Bruce Wayne. It feels like there's so many better ways to reveal this. Maybe when he shoots in between the plates in the suit, or maybe in a part of the game we never saw in the final release. Either way, it just felt off. It didn't feel very Arkham. Arkham has a good record of having some of its most powerful character moments through simple conversation, whether it be Arkham City's powerful ending where Batman calmly tells Joker he would have saved him, or Alfred telling Batman he isn't who he thinks he is, or even the shorter but equally as powerful conversations upon completing various side missions in this very same game, where Batman informs those closest to him of his impending death. See, it just doesn't feel very Arkham to have Jason Todd reveal he knows who Batman is while not looking him in the eye, rather gazing down on his ex-father from the perch of a giant riftworm-looking machine. Little Gears of War buzzword for you there. But anyway, hopefully you get my point. Adding on to this, the car is supposed to feel like an added bonus to the already perfect Arkham formula, adding a new layer of traversal, fun and speed to the game's movement, and maybe some added weaponry. It can't hurt to add more fun to a proven formula. But the way the car was integrated within the game leads me to come to the conclusion that, personally, I think it took a bit of the shine away from Batman himself. The Batmobile starts to feel like a character of its own, and not a gadget, because at the end of the day, the Batmobile is just that, it's a gadget employed by Batman. It's not an extension of him, it's an extension of the utility belt, and in Arkham Knight it takes on a life of its own, and that's where I think it becomes an issue. Another issue with the whole Batmobile situation is that it just wasn't needed to have Batman engage in multiple tank battles. Although they do serve the story and the immersion, the sheer number of tank battles, while initially fun, became repetitive due to the large number of enemy drones scattered throughout the game. There are so many. Like, some sections have you fighting over 20 tanks at once, and although this mirrors the large combat encounters seen in this game, we're used to fighting this many enemies. Hell, the very fibre of Arkham's DNA comes from the free flow system, but we're not used to fighting this many tanks, and it does get a bit stale. After a few hours fighting the tanks, it feels like you've done it all before. It gets old quickly, and there isn't a huge amount of creativity, and there just isn't a huge amount of depth to go along with it. For most part, it's shoot, dodge, and it just didn't carry the same weight as the combat system built up in the last 3 games, a system which was perfected in this game, but sadly got overshadowed by the car sections. The penultimate reason I think the Batmobile got the bad end of the Bat bargain is that it doesn't feel great to control. Now, this is entirely subjective, and there are times when it's really fun to drive, but often you feel a sense of being held back even with the afterburner unlocked. I can't help it when I drive the Batmobile that I feel it needs to be faster, and that's my only real complaint regarding the driving of it. It just isn't fast enough. When I think of the Batmobile, I think of a raw, unfiltered beast of a road that can just catch up with a civilian car with ease, like an almost omnipresent vehicle in the back window of a criminal's car. And the Batmobile in Arkham Knight just feels slow. It needed that extra oomph of power. I'm sure there are plenty of development issues and roadblocks which stopped it from going faster, but that's just my take on it. I just think it needed to be quicker. The other handling issue isn't in-game though, it's the controller. For 3 games we were conditioned that the left bumper was to activate detective mode, and this was the button we spend all our time spamming over the course of the 3 previous games. But then Arkham Knight comes along and all of a sudden that's to call the Batmobile, and that's just weird. This isn't really an issue, so to speak, but more of a slight quality of life tweak that I didn't appreciate because I'm a bitch. But outside of that, I think the car was also too light. It didn't feel weighty. The amount of time you flip over or just feel light while driving this is a little weird, when clearly this thing is supposed to weigh more than 2 countries. It just feels weird seeing the Batmobile elegantly float through the air and come to a soft landing. And this kind of ties into my speed issue. The car just needed more all-round oomph, just oomph everywhere. It needed more speed, more weight, while not sacrificing the handling, because the Batmobile isn't a normal car and thus doesn't need to apply itself to normal car rules. And I fully see how this can be seen as me directly contradicting what I just said, that it doesn't feel weighty enough despite looking like a house, but shut up, it's my video and I can say what I want. All jokes aside though, I hope that makes some sort of sense. Anyway, the final point is a short one. Some people just didn't want the car. I mean, Arkham was all about gliding, running, diving and sliding. Then all of a sudden it was all of the above, but there's a car looming over you. It was just jarring to add such a huge inclusion in the final game of the series. And this, to the Batmobile's credit and disservice, meant they had one shot at making it perfect, as they did with the combat, stealth and overall moment-to-moment gameplay. I think the car was an intriguing addition, especially in what, at the moment, is the final console game in the series with the Batmobile. Maybe in 10 years' time, hopefully, this video will age poorly when there's Batman Arkham Beyond and Arkham Contingency or some cool buzzword, which have both affected Batmobile driving mechanics. I think the Batmobile was an interesting case study because you've got 2 sides of the same coin. The first side is the fact that we finally get to drive a Batmobile in a AAA Arkham game, something which we asked for years upon years but never got. And the other side of the coin is the backlash, the unequivocal hatred aimed at the Batmobile and its inclusion in the game, and I think it makes for a lot of interesting talking points. The Batmobile in Arkham Knight seems to be a victim of its very existence. Rocksteady had one chance to try and craft a fun, lore-accurate Batmobile, and the fact we got what we did is a miracle. But considering the points we made above, the design, the placement, and the strange control scheme, we have to think that ultimately it was a mixed bag. But what about the other things in the bag? What about the good things? After all, I genuinely don't think that it was all bad. The Batmobile made some great waves and paved the way for future Arkham vehicles. Hopefully another Batmobile further down the road. So let's play devil's advocate and stick up for the Batmobile a bit. The Batmobile has a host of great reasons to love. One which I think people take for granted is how smoothly it integrates itself into gameplay, whether it be gliding around the city or bailing you out of a tight spot in missions. The way it blends perfectly into the overall feel of the game is great, and I kind of credit this to the lack of loading times for the car. For example, when remote driving it, there's no fade to it or loading screen. It's instantaneous, and that's exactly what it should be, because you'd think Batman's technology would be advanced enough to do that. So when it's all said and done, this feeds into the Batman fantasy and the Batman simulation feeling Arkham Knight gives us. Furthermore, the best way to transport yourself around the map comes not in the Batmobile, but from it. Ejecting from the seat and gliding through the cityscape is a great experience and is arguably faster than the car itself, which means the Batmobile kind of becomes a launching point rather than anything else. Personally, I really enjoy that feeling of ejecting from the car, and I think it's a great way of seamlessly integrating it into Batman's wider traversal, while not separating it from the traversal options that we're used to. Another great reason to love the Arkham Knight Batmobile is the tank combat. I know, it's the reason everyone hates it, but just hear me out. The combat itself and the movement in moment-to-moment gameplay is so smooth and satisfying. Hitting a critical point and watching the militia forces explode will never get old despite its overuse, and it just feels right, and I think this comes down to the responsive nature of the movement while in combat. Driving is a different story, but purely when it comes down to tank combat, the responsiveness and overall fluidity of dodging, firing, and using the abilities is really good, and this all comes together to create a genuinely skill-based system, which has a really low point of entry, but on the higher end of the spectrum, the skill ceiling can get pretty high. Nailing critical shots and using precisely timed dodges and making sure you're in a good position is genuinely fun and something I really enjoy. Is it quintessentially Arkham? No, it's not. Is it fun when you look at it from a purely unbiased view? Yeah, it is. It might not be what everyone wanted when we thought of driving the Batmobile, but when all's said and done, above all else, this is fun. And the tank combat, it's a mixed bag. You might love it, you might hate it, but the way it feels is great. Outside of combat though, the Batmobile is key to solving puzzles and navigating the world. Players can use the winch to pull walls down, create ramps around the world, raise platforms, and power up electrical systems, which open the world up for more exploration. This isn't a huge side of the Batmobile's game, don't get me wrong, but it's a side which adds a bit of depth to the overall experience of traversal. This can be accredited to the fact Rocksteady literally crafted the world around the Batmobile, which, say what you want about that, I'm not really sure how I feel about that. But either way, it can be used in so many great ways. And finally, my final point, it is a short one, but the different options presented by the skins is so cool. Being able to drive the 89 Batmobile, the Tumbler, and the original Arkham Batmobile, on top of a handful of other iconic designs is great, and this ability to have different skins and different models only increases with mods, which means you can basically drive any Batmobile ever, and any Bat vehicle ever. Overall, the Batmobile is a mixed bag. Visually, it's ugly. Gameplay-wise, it's misplaced and often forced. But if we look beneath those initial complaints, what we have is one of the more fun and integrated video game traversal systems ever. It works so well within the world of Arkham Knight, and despite its many flaws, it remains fun to use to this day. The Batmobile is hindered by its very existence because, well, no matter what they did, people would be unhappy, and I think it speaks to a wider issue with the audience. We complain about everything. Look, I'm not different. We all want more and more from these companies and developers, and oftentimes it just isn't possible for them to deliver on everything we want. And the Batmobile is the perfect case of this. We got a Batmobile, but it wasn't what we wanted specifically, so the community threw a fit for reasons which, let's be honest, looking back on the game a decade and so on, aren't that big of a deal. Whether you love it or you hate it, the Batmobile in Arkham Knight is a great advancement in the series, and hopefully in future installments. The already fun system can be built upon and expanded to be more user-friendly and less egregious and in the face of players. After all, I think I speak for everyone when I say we all want a Batmobile to drive in games, whether it be something like the Tumbler or something more sleek. At the end of the day, we can't all win, and I think that's a good note to leave this on. So, thank you for watching if you made it this far. Like, subscribe, I'll see you next time, and goodbye.